How I'd like to thank all the people for all the very positive reaction from the last story that I did, the one about the epidemics and that in Waterford. Now, in that story, I mentioned about St. Othran's Cemetery, Ballinasha. Now, why is it called Ballinasha? Well, Ballinasha is a very, very old name, and it's probably going back hundreds of years, and almost definitely would be associated with the tribe of the Daisha. There's probably a family out there who would have been known as Daisha. And the Daisha names were two names. The Daisha were Phelan and Brick, O'Phailon and O'Brick. So anybody by the name of Phelan, they're true Daisha men. And O'Brick is the same, a name more or less gone. So the area out there was called Ballinasha, the homeland of the Daisha. Simple as that. So I'll go back to the 1840s in Waterford. It was absolutely terrible. The graveyards here in the churches were packed to the top with people. So much so that even in London, the state of the Waterford cemeteries came to the notice of the medical boards. And I'll read that little relevant part for you. It says here, the chairman of the General Board of Health at a meeting in London raised the condition of Waterford City burial grounds. The chairman said, he had visited the graveyards in Cork and Waterford. So frightful was their condition that he cautioned those in power against him and assured those who had the power to correct the evil that if they did not do so, these consecrated cesspools, that's what he called them, would prove to be so many hotbeds of disease. They neglected his warning and his predictions were fearfully fulfilled. And that would be speaking about the 1832 cholera epidemic that I spoke about in the story the other day. And the report continues. In St. Donald's churchyard, the bodies have of late years been deposited in tiers, one above each other, just under the east window of the church, till they are within less than 3 feet of the surface, and in some places actually above the level of the ground, with 1 or 2 yards adjacent. While at certain periods and in certain states of the atmosphere, that's the weather, a putrid smell can distinctly be perceived in the neighbourhood of St. John's and St. Patrick's churches. Now, St. John's is the church at the back of Mason's nightclub there. That was St. John's Priory, and there's a large graveyard associated with that. So St. John's and St. Patrick's churchyard are much the same. We therefore submit that it is a duty of everyone, and especially of public bodies, to get rid of these nuisances. Well, that was the start of it. So, worse was to come, because in 1845 the famine began. People began to die in their hundreds in Waterford, and indeed in their thousands. And there was no place really to put them. They continued to try and bury him in the local graves, but also during the famine the corporation said you must start burying in Kilbarry Graveyard. Kilbarry Graveyard is still there out by Ballybeg, and Kill St. Lawrence is the other one that's out on the airport road. They very, very quickly became filled up, and there is actually one report of one of the corporation members going out to either Kill St. Lawrence or Kilbarry and to find that there were bodies had been thrown in a ditch. Some of them barely covered with a shovel full of earth, others just thrown in the ditch. Unbelievable stuff. And so there was a local doctor, a fellow by the name of Dr. Mackesy. Now, I see Michael Sullivan on the history side put up a notice about him the other day. He was a great guy, on the ball every time, a great, brilliant doctor. He was the guy who really kept an eye on the public health in Waterford. And I think there's a statue of him either down in the library. There was when I was there anyway, of Dr. Mackey, a bust I should say, not a full-length statue. So Dr. Mackesy said that he got a couple of friends and they went out and they bought a plot of land out the New Cork Road, as it was called at the time, and that was Ballinasha. Now, it opened in 1847. That was at the height of the famine. And eventually the Board of Guardians came in behind them and they built a wall around the area. There was no name on it. St. Othran's was a later name. It was just called either the New Cemetery or Ballinasha. And it was a multi-denominational graveyard. There was one part of it was for Catholics, other part was for Church of Ireland, for dissenters, another one, that'd be another like Protestants. There was ones then, the famine plot, there was a suicide plot, there was one there for babies, and there was all types of plots out there for the whole of Waterford City. And so that was enclosed in 1847. Because of a legal complication, they couldn't bury people there from the general population, like ordinary people, shall we say. So they began to bury from the workhouse. Whereas they didn't seem to have a choice, but it was a big mistake. Because even though, as I told you, how poor the people, ordinary people of Waterford were, they weren't paupers. They never saw themselves as paupers, and they certainly weren't going to be buried with paupers. And that's what happened to Ballinasha. It became the pauper's graveyard. Nobody wanted to be buried there. The Protestants in the workhouse said under no circumstances would they be buried out in Ballinasha. The workhouse up in John's Hill, now the St. Patrick's Hospital, the Fever Hospital was the other one, and anybody died there, they were buried automatically out in Ballinasha. So it was terrible. There was one man who was in the workhouse. When he got out of the workhouse and he went back to work, his wife was after dying and had been buried in Ballinasha. He applied to have her dug up to be buried in another graveyard, because if she was left there, he would always be known as the man whose wife was a pauper. That was the stigma attached to anybody that was buried in Ballinasha, and that went on and on. Now, nowadays we see burials out in Ballinasha, and we see the priest there, and decade of the rosary and prayers are said. Well, during the famine, there was no priest. It wasn't until the 20th century that priests began to attend funerals in Ballinasha. They did say prayers in the workhouse, in the dead house as they called it, in the mortuary, and they would be taken there on a cart out from the workhouse out to Ballinasha. Now, I came across a few reports that on the way out, it was probably at the Yellow House. Now, I don't know if the Yellow House was a pub back then, but I have a feeling that it was. But there was a pub someplace along the road, and the man in the cart would stop, especially if there was friends of the deceased there. And they would say, we'll have a drink. They'd go in and they'd have a couple of drinks. The coffin would be outside on the horse and cart. They'd come out, they'd lift the lid of the coffin to have one last look of your man, of his friend, after having a couple of drinks, and off and upwards to Ballinasha. Then, if the caretaker wasn't there to meet the horse and cart with the coffin on it, the coffin would be taken off the hearse and left out of the front gate. Now, the caretaker would have a cart to bring it up, but I can tell you that it wasn't always the case that it would reach the famine plot, which is right at the very top of Ballinasha on the right hand side as you're looking into Ballinasha. It's a beautiful stone there now, but so it is often they were buried in a more convenient place. So that's the way it went. But in 1849, when the cholera epidemic struck, the coffin makers in Waterford were cribbing. They wrote a letter to the paper saying, what's going on? We're not being asked to build any coffins. And so that suggests that the people from the workhouse weren't being buried in coffins. They would be buried just in a shroud or in a sack and buried down. And that's the way it was. They then tried to popularise Ballinasha, because there was nobody, as I said, there was nobody who had been buried there. And in actual fact, it wasn't until the 1950s, 60s that people began to be buried. The taint of pauperism began to actually go down a little bit, subside a bit. But up to that, no way, under no circumstances. The main burial ground in Waterford was Ballygunner. Now, those people from, we say, the city centre would be buried in Ballybricken graveyard, and that was relatively a new church. That wasn't built up around 1808, 1811, and it had a small graveyard which expanded attached to it. So local people were buried in Ballinasha. But by and large, it was Ballygunner. St. Stephen's, St. Lawrence's and and Kilbarry were closed in 1860, supposedly, but they weren't always. They were still throwing bodies in there. And I was talking to a man one day, and he told me that when he was a young fella, that his uncle was the caretaker out in Ballinatia, and he used to spend the summer holidays, and every morning his uncle would send him around the walls of Ballinatia to look for the body of a baby that might be thrown over the wall. Because you see, it's hard to even think about it. Excuse me. People didn't have money. You had to pay to have a grave opened. You had to pay to have a grave dug. People didn't have the money. Now, what I'm going to say is true, but there are many, a woman had a stillborn child, and depending on the term of the baby, if it was relatively small, relatively a couple of weeks old, a month or two old, what often happened was it didn't reach any graveyard. It was buried out the back. And I was told that by a woman who told me of a neighbour of ours that buried the baby out the back. If there was a full-term baby or anything like that, or close to full-term, yes, it would be buried in it. And a neighbour of mine told me that she had a baby in May Park, and the baby was dead. So my mother left her home in Dial Street with a wicker basket under her arm and walked from Dial Street out to May Park. They put the dead body of the baby in the basket, and my mother walked back to Dial Street and gave the basket to the husband of the man, and he buried it. Now, why didn't he go out? Well, there were certain things that men didn't do, like pushing prams, things like that. That wasn't a man's job, perceived as a man's job. It was a cultural thing, and that's the way it was. But it's not that I was shocked. I was happy to think that my mother did that. She would have been probably in her mid to late teens when she walked out and got the baby. But that's the way it was in Waterford. So Ballinatia. So how many people are buried out there? Haven't got a clue. But I do know that for the first 10 years of Ballinatia, from 1847 to 1857, there was 4,000 paupers. Now, buried in. That was a term that was used. I'm not calling these people paupers, but that was the term that was used. 4,000 paupers were buried. Now, if you're interested in Ballinatia, all the books are online. You can go online and you can see them, and I think they're down. John Thompson also has, the local undertaker, also has some of his books online. There's great resources out there. You can go online. If you have any problems finding these things, just go on Facebook and just drop me a line on Facebook, and I can send you the link to some of those. But that's Ballinatia for you. So, like, there was no priest there, and it wasn't, I said, until the 20th century that priests began to attend funerals out there. So that's it. It's a gem. It's a gem to actually have a famine graveyard that's still in existence in Waterford. Most famine graveyards are small little plots around the place, but we have it, and it's active. People are still being buried there. My own family, my grandmother, my mother and father, are buried in Ballinatia, and it's great to think that it went from a place that was stigmatised, that nobody wanted to go, to a place where now everybody would want to go. As one local wit said, people are dying to be buried out there. A baby that died before it was born, stillborn child, would be buried in unconsecrated ground, because they believed when it wasn't baptised, it would go to a place called Limbo. I know many people probably never heard of Limbo. Was a place where unbaptised babies went to until such time as, through God's grace, they would be taken to heaven. Something like purgatory, but not for sinners. So, because a baby wouldn't be able to commit a sin. But that's the way it was. It was a different world even back in my youth as it is today. People are more enlightened, people ask questions, and we should always ask questions. So there you have it. Ballinatia, 1847, September 1847 was when it opened up, and the price of the first burial, and buried at the time, was 6p to be buried in Ballinatia. Talk to you in the next episode. Hope you enjoyed. By the way, I forgot to say that I got a present of a book yesterday. Some people are asking me, Jenna, what could I have about these sites? There was one or two people that I told sites to go to, like this Waterford City Council site. Got excellent books on it, all for free. And again, the burial records of Ballinasha and John Thompson's are online if you want to see those. But the book was written by a local man, Billy Costine. I'm sure most of you know Billy, a bus driver in Waterford here. And he wrote of his experience of going to China and meeting a young woman who is now his wife. And it's absolutely... Billy, probably like myself, left school very early. But I was amazed at how well written the book is. There's 376 pages in the book. And I was gobsmacked reading the book. It's so easy to read. The print is large. Everything about it. I couldn't recommend it high enough. So if you want to get a good local book, Billy Costine, My Chinese Experience is called. I would highly recommend it 1000%. Talk to you in the next episode.